Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for OUA football. Me and Tom are back on the mics to set up week 6 in the OUA season. We have an incredible slate of games as always. Me and Tom mentioned this on the preview, pardon me, the review from last week. We're going to be in the house for one of those. We'll go through all of those. Hilarity will no doubt ensue. Tempers will fly, but it doesn't happen before I say, Tom, how the heck you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great today. We got another great weekend of football, and we had a little bit of a snafu originally. We weren't sure if we were going to make it this game, but we secured the tickets. We got ourselves in there, so we will be live and direct from one of them. If you listen to the review pod, you already know, but I'm building suspense for some reason. And so, yeah, I'm doing great.
Well, I'll go ahead and break the suspense to this. The very first game we're going to talk about, it's Queens at Windsor. Pardon me, Queens at Western. Goodness gracious. Tom, what's going on? Queens at Western. The Ponies coming off of the bye week. And this is a Queens team coming off a exciting victory at home against my Guelph Griffins. Your Guelph Griffins, everybody's Guelph Griffins. Tom, last time we saw Western in action, they were falling to the Laurier Golden Hawks. You referenced your 2011 team, I believe it was. Maybe I have the year wrong. One of the years that you had beat Western and Coach Potasic had advised you enjoy the win, go out and celebrate it. But bear in mind, you might have poked the bear. Western goes on the bye week, and we've seen them a little banged up thus far this year. So, no doubt important for them to get that in, and they're coming back with their homecoming, with their arch rivals, the Queens Golden Gales, looking high and mighty, actually sitting ahead of them right now in the standings. Queens with that 4-1 record, sitting in third. Western at 3-1, technically in fourth right now. This is a blood rivalry. It's going to be packed stands. You alluded to, we actually had to try and pull a few strings to get in the house, but we had obviously already talked so much smack to some of our Queens friends in our review pod that we had to make sure we got into it. Obviously, there's so much excitement on the field, off the field. There's a lot of great storylines. What's the number one thing you're looking at with this game that's gotten you the most excited?
Oh goodness. I think having a rivalry game on homecoming of all places is going to be such an awesome atmosphere. I think that the history of the rivalry is kind of boiled all the way down for the students there. They're just like, yeah, I don't like Queens because Queens sucks without any real emphasis as to why afterwards, but the meaning of it doesn't really matter as much to the young kids that are going to be there, the students that are going to be there. It's just the fact that these teams don't like each other, and that's going to be an awesome atmosphere with a packed house. And like we mentioned, we were struggling to get tickets. We looked at getting tickets on Monday and they were already sold out. So this is a big game. There's going to be people there. I can't wait to watch it with you, my guy.
Yeah, oh, it was right back at you, man. And obviously, we've seen these teams tee off a few times over the decade with them matching up in those Yates Cups in 21 and 22. We obviously saw the playoff matchup last year in the semifinals with Western knocking Queens out. We saw the incredible finish when they duked it out at Richardson Stadium last year around week 3, week 4, when Hillock hooked up with his guy, Savon Magne Jones, for the game winning touchdown that provided one of the best calls in OUA football history. And you know what? Western's has had Queens' number. It's one of those rivalries that, as you're kind of alluding to, you kind of on orientation day at Western, it's like, okay, here's the athletic center. Here's where you need to go if you want to get some food on campus. And by the way, you hate Queens. And then if you look at the stats, you're like, wait a minute, why is this a rivalry? It doesn't really feel like it. Tom, you pulled up some of the numbers. It's been about over a decade since Queens really had Western's number, flipping the script on it. And these have been some good Queens teams, a bit of a fallow period for a little bit. Obviously, that program is good at restocking the cupboard. But again, there's so many similarities with these clubs, whether it's Steve Snyder going from Western into Queens, rebuilding that program, people like Coach Matt Nesbitt coming from London, all these similarities. Um, let's look at the on-field product now, right? Because it's the Queens team where we've seen obviously when they're healthy, they're feeding Jared Cassari the ball. They're running with the best of them. And it gives Vreekin a bit more of that safety net to be able to find his guys like Nico Cuemo, to be able to find some of his other receivers who be able to make big plays. When Cassari goes down, all of a sudden, it looks like it might be a bit too much for Vreekin to handle. He comes back last week, almost it seems like out of necessity, knowing how big that game was for Guelph, and he not only is able to get some good production on the ground, but we see Vreeken do some really great things. And as we saw, like Nathan Falcone went off. So Western defense that, they got a little humbled 2 weeks ago at Laurier, and they still were missing Kojo Odium. We saw Max Nixon in there, but we know he'd been banged up a little bit. I can't remember exactly if there were any pieces missing. But again, a team that was humbled on the road, first regular season loss, and I forget how many days, 1,000 something days at home on their homecoming, with a banged up Queens team coming off a physical, chippy, emotional game. How do you see that playing in where on the one hand, Western has, always has this game circled, and no doubt Queens does as well. And Western's just been able to get healthy and look at this game as not just another rivalry, but also these guys are literally ahead of us on the schedule. It's been, frankly, I don't know how long it's been since Western's had to look up at Queens.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there, especially with the fact that Queens is technically above them on the standings, but I'm positive that Western is not looking at that right now. What I will say is that the mentalities for both of these clubs, I'm sure going into this is going to lead to a lot of things as well. When you look at Queens, they beat a very good Guelph team, and they did it pretty decidedly. And I don't mean decidedly as they blow them out, because obviously that's not the case, but they were convincing as they did it. They performed very well, offense, defense, and special teams, and they really came together. And it shows, the I don't want to say the lack of faith, but what we thought was going into this, out of the 6 pickers that we have with the at the 55, when we put those out, 4 of them picked Guelph to win that game. Of course, the homebody, Mr. Eric Colonna, he picked his Golden Gales to win that. But still, it shows that we thought a Queens team was real banged up. They weren't going to be able to hang, and they did exactly that. They really showcased themselves. Alex Vreeken came out exactly like you said. So they're coming into this with a real high, with a confidence that's on their shoulders of, you know what, we're Queens. We're getting back to form. This is back to where we're expected to be, and we can really feel confident about that. On the Western side of things, you and I both know that when you play a game, you may not think about that game in the next week, but the emotions of that game are still with you. So you really played well. You beat a Western team. You go into the next week, you feel great, you feel confident, and you carry that emotion. Even if you don't think about the game, you carry that into the next week. Equally the same when you have a loss. And when you have a loss, all you want to do is just get to the next game so you can get that win again and you can really get that momentum back. Western lost to Laurier. They've had to hear all about how it's the first time in the regular season they've lost in 1,000 days, all of this stuff, from us and everybody else around the OUA who's covering this. And then you have a bye week into that. So you are stewing in that loss feeling, in that anger and the emotion of just trying to want to get back out there, want to get better. And they haven't been able to actually play a game until this week. So I think these Western ponies are going to be just itching to get back on the field and erase that terrible loss taste in your mouth.
No, absolutely. Right. And obviously with the veteran presence in that locker room, and both in the players and from the coaching standpoint, you just know that when you give them that much time to prepare, it's a scary prospect. And I want to stick. I want to go over to the Western offensive side of things. Definitely want to come back to the defense that they have, because we talked about how Vreeken was able to make some big plays downfield against Guelph, and we've really loved Guelph this year, and offensively how sharp they're looking. And that defense, the same as last year. Obviously, Coach Barry, it's a different coordinator, but that, there was a few times where Vreeken's hitting them downfield a little bit. And obviously, when it comes to defensive secondaries, Western's perhaps second to none, if only maybe the Ottawa Gigi. So it's certainly going to be a much bigger task for Vreeken. But I want to go to the offense side of the ball, and perhaps it's just because they had the bye week and there was so much excitement last week. But it's so remarkable how just much of a product of the moment we are sometimes, where we've seen Keegan Hall put together the season of all seasons, where I think we were saying off mic, like if they put together enough wins and if Elgersma can get knocked down a step in some form or fashion, with their season, either with a lackluster game here or there, I mean, I don't know how the MVP votes break out in the league, because someone's made the terrible mistake over these last 7 years we've been doing this and hasn't given us a vote on the matter. But Mr. Keegan Hall certainly should be receiving some votes on that front. You look through the leaders in the passing game, and Evan Hillock's right there, right? And obviously Elgersma Hall, we obviously been talking about how spectacular these young kids and Elijah Barnes and Caleb O'Donoghue are. We talk so much about the combined efforts of Tristan Aboud. We talk about Marshall McCray. We look at Alex Vreeken as the high highs and some of the low lows, and then some of these other guys, like, is it Danny Skelton? Is it Ben Miracle? And there's Evan Hillock he does so well, being so incredibly efficient. He's got 9 touchdowns on the year, only 2 interceptions. His yards per game don't blow, knock your socks off in the way that Elgersma does. But I feel like for Hillock, and we go back to that game against Laurier, again, he goes 18 for 31, 322, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. And you say to yourself, okay, 18 for 31, maybe a few more missed balls than you expect. But again, that's a line where I'd say for 9 other teams in the OUA, maybe 8, 9 teams, you're like, yeah, we would love to have that kind of day. And we're saying you let your team down a little bit on the day. He's got his guys like Seth Robertson, like Mohsen Jamal, being able to hand it off to all these running backs. I feel like, again, maybe it's just the bye week piece. And maybe it's because it's the bye week on top of them falling to Laurier. And Laurier is obviously, is the hot story right now. But I feel like we're kind of sleeping on Western. We as a collective OUA zeitgeist. We talked about how exciting a week was of football, and in part, a lot of close games, because when you don't have Western playing, your odds increase by a significant jump that no one's going to get blown out. I feel like just generally there's a bit of an uncomfortable calm before the storm of, like, guys, like, public service announcement. The Western Mustangs are playing football this weekend for their homecoming at home against an arch rival. Like, be on alert, folks. Like, this could be like, they're no doubt just champing at the bit to go off here.
Oh, Western doesn't need any excuses to get up for a game. They certainly have Coach Marshall, who is a legendary coach. And once again, I've said this a few times, but if there's a coach in the OUA who deserves to have a statue outside of the stadium that they're in, it is 100% Coach Greg Marshall, with all the wins that he has had. So they don't need an additional reason to really go off and have a win here. But they've got as many possible reasons as they could possibly hope for, with, like I said, all of the people who are focusing on the loss, everybody who's like, oh, you know what, Western they've lost a step. They're not the same team anymore. They're a 3-time Yates Cup back-to-back champion for a specific reason. And something that I wanted to point out here, and I love the fact that you brought up Evan Hillock with the 9 touchdowns. Certainly in the grand scope of youth sports, he's tied right now in touchdown passes with one Arnaud Desjardins out of the Laval Rouge et Or, which obviously is a really outstanding team to be compared to. And you've got guys like Keegan Hall who have 8 touchdown passes and all of that stuff. The thing that I want to bring your attention to is the attempts. Keegan Hall has 8 touchdown passes with 183 passing attempts. Evan Hillock has 9 touchdown passes with 100 passing attempts. He's got more touchdown passes with 83 less attempts than when Keegan Hall, even Arnaud Desjardins, has 129. So the dude, whatever you want to say about him, he doesn't have the same throwing mechanics, or he doesn't throw on the run as well, whatever. The dude scores touchdowns, and he scores a lot.
That's a beautiful stat. And, like, you go back to the Laurier game, the Seth Robertson touchdown called back, and the numbers wouldn't be perfect, but literally I wasn't aware of that stat. To contextualize that, every 10 passes he throws, he gets a touchdown, is what that equates to. That's incredible. Yeah. Sorry, Tom, you keep on that. That's amazing.
No, but that just goes to show you that this kid is just damn good at football. His stats on the year, he's 62 for 100 for 967 yards. Like you said, the yardage per game don't scream off the page by any means, but the 9 touchdowns should. With how more often other teams in the league in all of you sports are throwing to get to the same kind of numbers. And like I mentioned, it's him and Desjardins who are tied for first place. Everybody else has less than 9. So he's efficient, especially getting into the red zone or especially throwing dots to his guys down the field here. And he's definitely somebody to look out for in this one. And so you go into this, you go, oh my gosh, it's Evan Hillock, it's Seth Robertson, it's the entirety of that passing game. And then, oh yeah, yoo-hoo, here's Keon Edwards and Keanu Yazbek ready to run down your throat as well to take all of the pressure off of Mr. Hillock and off of that passing game and to say, if you try to focus on the pass, we will run the ball down your throats. I am 100% convinced that if Coach Marshall could, he wouldn't throw the ball once. I think if he could run 70 run plays in a row per game and always get first downs or always touchdowns, he would not throw the ball once. So you're going to have to prove to him that he needs to throw. And then when he does throw, he's got one of the league's best doing it.
Yeah. I mean, and offensive coordinator Gaetan Richard, I don't think has any problems with that because he's certainly been able to put together some great running teams with this club. And, running the ball is just as much Queens MO as it is for Western. And obviously, again, it's Keon thus far this year, Keon Edwards, that is, for Western. Not the year of years that we've expected from him. I mean, he's obviously had some great days, but having an averager in the mid 80s, which again, 8, 9 other teams in the league are saying, yeah, give me a star running back who's going to get that. We understand. Bit less than where we might expect to see him in normal years, but just a game where, like you normally have for Queens and Western, all eyes have to be in the trenches. And we talk about the injuries for Western. It's been Keegan O'Neill who's been hurt a little bit on that offensive line. But again, they got our guy in Eric Anderson, one of, if not the best tackles in all of Canada, going up against one of, if not the best defensive lines for these Queens Golden Gales. Do we need to say the names? They're Silas Hubert, they're Van Wisher, they're Darian Newell, Eric Johnston, that kid,
Oliver Jackson, who had a hell of a game against Guelph.
Most certainly. And then on the flip side, so, in that matchup, I think as a unit, I'm probably giving it to Queens because we've seen Keegan O'Neill banged up. Pardon me. As a singular talent, yeah, I'm still going to say Eric Anderson. I'm going to take him in my first overall draft pick over all those dudes. On the flip side, though, I mean, you look at this Queens O-line that's been super banged up as well. And though the Western D-line doesn't necessarily have, again, that dude that just gives you the nightmares the way the Queens D-line does. And obviously they got our guy like Max von Muhldorfer. They got a guy in Soren Hallschmidt who's really good. My dude in Marcus Robinson, and a few other guys, Malcolm Frazier, who we've seen banged up this year. But it's in that second line there in the middle with the linebackers and obviously names like Riley McLeod, Max Nixon, and the new kid on the scene for them, and Jude Buchanan, just shot out of a cannon, looking like half the time, where it's going to be absolute fireworks in the middle. And obviously that Queens linebacking core is no slouch. With the way these back ends play, as far as that Queens secondary and this Western secondary, I think on the whole, you might be able to give an edge to, okay, we got the Queens D-line here against the Western O-line. We might say, okay, we might say the same thing for the Western front seven against the banged up Queens O-line. Maybe you call the secondaries a wash one way or the other. I think that, yeah, we just went over how great Hillock's been. And if they do get that run game going, that'll give him more opportunities. But with guys like Vanek and with Miller Melanson on the back end, you know what? Tread lightly. And for Vreeken, I mean, do we need to tell you who Richard Adubafor is, who Jackson Finley is, who Jordan Murphy is, if Kojo Doom's in there? So I think really it's going to come down to the battle in the trenches, Tom, and you analyze it like that. Obviously, some names that we don't know if they're all going to be there yet. Where do you lean in terms of giving an edge, in terms of offensive line, H-back as well? Because we know both these teams use an H-back incredibly well. Craig Coleman for Western. I forget the new H-back that Queens has been using because they made Nicholas Henning a right tackle now. So you include O-line, H-back, D-line linebackers. If you were going to say, I'm going to give a favorite to one over the other, where are you leaning at this point in the season?
My goodness, hitting me with the tough questions, and I believe just pulling up the roster here, it's James Preston,
It is. Yes. Thank
H-back
you.
for Queens. I believe that's who the
Yeah.
person is. When you look at both of these squads, and especially in those front sevens, I think you see different ways of getting the job done. With Queens, we just listed that outstanding defensive line, and they really are able to do some fantastic things. We mentioned in the review pod with Guelph, don't do a long lasting play action play in the backfield because you can only block Silas for so long until he's getting back there. So this D line is able to get pressure pretty consistently on their own. I think the way that Western really takes over games, especially on the defensive side of things in that front seven, is that you have guys on that D line who aren't necessarily these game changers by any means, but you're not blocking Max von Muhldorfer with one dude consistently. Like he's gonna make some issues happen in the run game, certainly if you do that. And I think there's still a load to deal with everybody on that D line. And what that does is it frees up your linebackers to really do their thing. Riley McLeod is a fantastic middle linebacker without any other additional help. But the fact that he's consistently pretty clean when you look at a lot of these run plays and even some of these passing routes as well, or when he blitzes, taking on a running back in the hole, 9 times out of 10, Riley's winning that battle as well. So where Queens is able to really just lean on their D line to really get things done for the most part, I think Western's strength is having a solid D line that doesn't make a lot of mistakes and leaves their linebackers with the capabilities to really do some things. Riley McLeod is obviously great. I don't think we talk about how impressive Jude Buchanan looks like if he's getting eaten up every single play by offensive linemen who are coming after him here for exactly that reason. Not to take anything away from that young man, but when you're consistently getting blocked by 300+ pound monsters of humans, it's going to take a toll on you at certain times here. So two different areas to get out in that regard. When looking at these front sevens, I'm probably going to give it to Queens because
Mm.
that D line is so good. Once again, we talked about one of my absolute favorite people to watch is Justin Pace in the middle linebacker spot for Queens because of all the capabilities that he's able to do. That D line is really outstanding here. So when you're looking at it from a front seven standpoint, I'm giving the edge to Queens.
Yeah, and I might be there with you, and of course you add Liam Sutherland in the mix too for them. It's a deadly combo, but again, it's just this is the whole thing where I think we were saying this even off of Western falling to Laurier, where hey Laurier, good for you, you finally did it. In all likelihood, you have to try. You're if you're gonna be a betting person, you have to do that a second time this year. And hey, we picked Laurier twice last year to take out Western for all the good reasons in the world, but it's such a tall task, and the reason it gives you pause is just that like the priors this team has built up. It makes you feel silly saying that any team kind of has an edge on them in any standpoint. But this Queens defensive line, like that Queens D line, might be the best unit like that any team has at any position, right? Maybe Laurier's receivers, right? We could look at some other positions, but like those guys, those dudes are absolute menaces. I guess Tom, we didn't really talk about the back ends other than not to say it's a wash, but again, it's if you're game planning for this, man, well, I mean, you don't really want to run into either of those front sevens, but you certainly don't want to leave balls up in the air. I love the point you made about the play action and how that was ineffective for Guelph, and certainly we've come to see as it became a big point of conversation for folks coming off of the loss to Laval. You brought up the Rouge et Or 2 years ago that Western had in the semifinal, where a lot of the conversation was, hey, Western, can you throw the ball downfield without it coming off the back of a play action? They came out last year with a vengeance, clearly showing they could do that. And I think that'll be something they have to be able to lean on to try and lighten up that box a little bit. And frankly, the same's probably going to be true of Queens. But you know what? At the end of the day, this one's a tough one to pick, though we probably should make our picks because we've probably eaten up about half our pod time just talking about this game so far. And we could certainly go for another stretch. This is one where, as these teams have been banged up, it's kind of hard to see until they're on the field because there's so many key players and positions where it's like, all right, if Kojo's there and he can just say, all right, great, you're going on Nathan Falcone where he goes, you are. It's like, well, that's helpful to know. If Jared Kasari is just healthy and that O-line's back in action, then you think, okay, maybe that lightens up this back end, and then it gives Vreekin a couple opportunities for some shots downfield. If Keegan O'Neal's healthy and he's back in there, if all these things, right, that we don't know from where we stand right here, but what we do know is we got to make picks. Tom, where are you going with this one?
We talked about how incredible that Queens defense is, and without even getting into the back end with guys like Keegan Vanek and Ashton Miller Melanson, this is a very impressive Queens team, especially on the defensive side. We had a lot of questions about the offense, and I think Alex Vreekin last week, while certainly there's a lot of things to clean up, I think he's finally starting to come into his own a little bit here. But I ain't picking against the ponies in this one. I'm going with Western. I think that on that bye week, they've been stewing on a loss, thinking about Queens, thinking about this arch rival. I think that Evan Hillock goes off and he really showcases his stuff. And you might just see, don't you dare let Seth Robertson get into that end zone, because you're going to see another oil thigh come from that young man if you let him do that.
Great call by you. And if it happens to be in the stadium side end zone, then Tom, you and I might be right there along with him, oil thighing alongside with him. You know what? If the schedules had broken out a little bit differently and Western were coming off of, they looking ahead, they still play Mac, they still play Windsor, nothing to take away from their game against U of T, but they still have two really strong opponents coming. And if the schedule broke out a little bit differently, that they were coming off of one of those games with their bye still to come, I might have felt a little more bullish taking Queens on the road with how good they've been looking. That defense, again, being so spectacular, but coming off the bye, coming off that loss, it would be a spectacular thing to be in the house to see Queens go there on Western's homecoming and pick up the win. And you know what, Peter Bierce, if that comes true, hey, drinks are on us, brother. But I ain't gonna bet on that coming to fruition, Tom. I'm right there with you, but I expect a physical, tough game, packed house. Like, this is going to be, again, thank you so much to the folks at Western able to get us in for this one. Because, this is going to be, I guess I'm quoting myself on this one. So if the Western social media people are listening in, must watch game. But everyone already knew that. It's Queens, it's Western. Let's move on to our next game. Also at 1:00, heading back to the K-Dub, the Laurier Golden Hawks are hosting the Ottawa GGs. Tom, Laurier's coming off the Battle of Waterloo, and not just the Battle of Waterloo. We mentioned this reviewing week 5. Obviously an emotional game when you're playing, the crosstown down the street rival off of the win against Western. Huge emotion, having followed them twice the year before, including in the Yates Cup. And before that, the Guelph game, just the emotional high, and not just emotional high, but the emotional toll that takes on you. We pair that up with the discussions we've had about how our OUA MVP's been had a little bit of trouble controlling his emotions at times. And I think it's fair to, though we know he's a very fired up guy, and that's what makes him so magical and so special, I think it's fair to perhaps prognosticate that maybe one has to do the other. And you look at how Waterloo in bringing pressure was able to get to him a few times and force him to make a few mistakes. And then we see a team in Ottawa where, as we said, coming off the Windsor game, emotional loss. Obviously, if we can't be like, wow, Laurier's dealing with all these emotions and Ottawa's just going to come in here and just super chill. A crazy finish to that game in Windsor, where I'm sure the folks in Ottawa maybe still feel like they got robbed on the back end of that one. We're pretty confident they figure out their quarterbacks. I would be genuinely surprised if it's number 12 trotting out there to start. Josh Jansen looks like he took this position as he came in midway through that game and really had a solid outing against one of the best defenses in Windsor. And so you look at this on the surface, it's Ottawa on the road, having come back from Windsor and then having to head back to Laurier. They've struggled offensively immensely. King Charles Aslan, at his best, has been one of the best in the passing game. They haven't got much going, but Aslan's been banged up. And on the surface, you look at this and you say, well, all right, Laurier, thank you, next. But there is the part of me that wonders, with a really strong defense that Ottawa touts, and perhaps having now been able to prep for a week, being like, it's Josh Jansen on offense and Charles Aslan having a bounce back game off of being a bit injured. Is this that, proverbial trap game especially with a Queens team lingering the week following for Laurier coming into your barn as well, that maybe people are sleeping and just looking at it on the calendar. You look at a Laurier team that's sitting right, pardon me, an Ottawa team right now sitting at 2-3, still really hungry. They got Panda games still on the cusp and everything like that. But a team where if you let too many of these slip away at this point, you might be at risk of missing the playoffs. A really hungry Ottawa team, a Laurier team coming off these emotional wins, and with another major matchup the next week. I think I know where I'm going with this one. We'll obviously talk it out, but I think this is one people might be overlooking when they look at it on the schedule.
Listen, when we were going into this game last year, Laurier's traveling to Ottawa. They're on something of a heater after coming off of their past two games. There's no Ben Miracle because he's injured. Ryan Lacandro and is been injured as well. We really don't know what to make of this Josh Jansen kid. That the final score in that one is 38-30 for Laurier. And in that game, I would say Josh Jansen, at least purely on the stat line, outplays Taylor Elgersma. Final stats between these two last year, Taylor Elgersma 22 for 32, 257 yards, one touchdown, one pick, versus Josh Jansen's 20 for 27, 233 yards, two touchdowns, no picks. And you and I are looking around going, oh, wow. Now, of course, they had Amikar Polk that last game. He goes off 18 attempts for 113 yards and one touchdown. But then also Charles Aslan only has one catch for 9
I
yards.
saw that. Yeah.
So he's not a non-factor here, and now has put on the crown, as we have dubbed him, King Charles, and is a real main focal point of this. If he can now get complemented with a Josh Jansen and a reinvigorated passing attack, like we saw in the second half of that Windsor game, or saw a little bit of with the stream, don't want to go ahead and get into that again. I think that you are right in that this has the makings to be a much tighter game than what people may just automatically assume here. Certainly, if we see a similar performance that we saw last game, not to say that Laurier wasn't impressive last game, I think very confidently say they did not have their best game. They had a ton of penalties. Mr. Elgersma throws 3 interceptions. We've talked about it a few times. This is arguably one of, if not the best defensive secondaries in the OUA right now, with just all of the amazing bodies that they have back there. A solid enough defensive front seven here to at least make you respect what's going on. Do not sleep on these Ottawa GGs. If that offense can find its rhythm and get back to form like they were last year, they could start upsetting a few folks.
Yeah, no, for sure. The one thing I'll be curious to see, and it's been what's so impressive with Ottawa, where you go back 2 years ago and it's obviously JP at the helm. You go back and but you have obviously Amikar Polk getting some action there as that next option. He becomes the guy, and yeah, he's one of the top runners in the OUA. He's getting all Canadian looks and things like this. And Charles Aslan's there, but waiting in the wings. And then Polk moves on. Aslan steps up. When you look around this Ottawa team, and obviously it might be a product of the fact that Miracle having the majority of the snaps for them offensively, he wasn't connecting with his guys. And we obviously know what a guy like Maxime Melifon can do when he's really on. Kerwin Geist, we've seen some good things from. Suleiman Kamara as that second option, the running back, and in the running back field. And when you use him, that means you can put Aslan into the slot and do some fun, creative things with him. And guys like Noah Avery as well. But there's a bit of a chicken and the egg thing going on. And, I'm certainly not well versed enough in the full mechanics of what their offensive system is to begin with, let alone when you see the problems we've seen from their passing game. Is it that, yeah, Ben Miracle hasn't just had it going? And they obviously believe that to some extent because they've seemingly moved past it. Or are we just do we not have that next man up for them? Again, they have some solid guys in here. Geist, Avery, Couillard, Aslan, Maxime Melifon, who might not have even been playing in that Windsor game because I'm looking through the box score and I'm not seeing his name. But if it is Jansen, again, it's going to be interesting to see who's the guy that's going to step up for them to start making plays. You go back to that game last year where they kept it in tight, and yeah, it was Polk running the ball, but you still have a our guy Nicolas Gendron as that go-to number one receiver. And we've already said his name a few times. Melafont was with him at East West, also a decorated receiver, and maybe he was injured, and so hopefully he'll be back. But it's worth noting that we're tough on Miracle, but at a certain point here, yeah, we've seen there's balls where he's just missing, but we got to eventually see like who's going to be the guy, because you go through the top leaders of in terms of who's receiving the ball, whether it's straight yards, receptions per games. You got to scroll down quite a bit to see some of those Ottawa GGs pop up on there. And again, the obvious answer, the easy answer might just be that Miracle hadn't been playing well. And maybe that is the case. But again, and the fact that they obviously feed Aslan the ball a whole lot, looking to see who's going to be that next option for them, because their defense, their special teams units in terms of returning the ball are spectacular. But especially against a team like this Laurier Golden Hawks club, like, it's going to be like we're going to have to print T-shirts of Charles Asselin if he puts up the type of performance where he can single-handedly produce enough offense in the rushing attack and in some screen games, swing passes, get him in the slot. That's going to be able to say like, oh, you know what? No one else still stepped up, but he was still able to produce the type of scoring for them to stay tight with a Laurier offense where, as good as this Ottawa defense is, Laurier's going to get theirs. It's certainly not going to be a situation where Ottawa shuts them out. Again, we said that last week didn't look like Laurier's best offensive attack. They put up 555 yards of offense. So at a certain point, you got to keep up with them. And this Ottawa defense can score points, but I'm curious who that guy is in the version in the timeline that exists out there somewhere, where come Sunday we're talking about Ottawa picking up the huge upset win in Laurier. It's got to be, Charles Asselin went off and Jansen had a great game feeding the ball to blank. And that's the part right now that, the easy answer might be Maxime Melafont. We just haven't seen it yet this year.
I don't know if it's fair to say that we haven't seen it as of yet, or have they been truly given the proper opportunities in order to showcase
Totally.
that?
Yes.
You go chicken and the egg, you go all of that, whatever, because that, like we had mentioned previously, when you and I were live and direct for York, Ottawa, we were looking at some of the throws that Mr. Miracle was making and going, this is not the Ben Miracle that we know and love. This seems strange. So regardless, maybe it's just that these receivers in this secondary, or the offensive secondary, really hasn't been given the proper amount of time and the proper amount of opportunities to really showcase themselves, in which case would be very exciting. We've talked a whole lot about Ottawa here. Switching things up to go a little bit on the Laurier side of things, because they are the number one team in the land for a damn good reason. I know you're a GG's fan at heart and you're trying to steer this towards the GG's.
I'll bring it back. Don't worry. I'll bring it back.
You are the host. You are the host. One degree of always go back to wherever you want.
1 degree of separation from the GG's at all time. Go ahead, Tom. My apologies.
I think that this Laurier squad has the capabilities to continue to get better and better and better and better. And I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at the game that they had just played against the Battle of Waterloo. I'd be shocked if anybody in that Laurier clubhouse, offense, defense, or special teams, goes, that was good enough performance. We're happy with that. I think they're going into this and really dissecting a lot of things. I think one of the things that we had spoken about, and obviously being the penalties, I would not be surprised if the helmet toss that you so beautifully detailed in the review becomes the focal point in a lot of those meetings that Coach Faulds and the rest of those coaches points out and says, never again can anything like this ever happen.
Yeah.
And you use that as the straw that broke the camel's back, essentially, and saying, we need to clean things up. We need to do this, whatever. Because that's at certain points, even with some unnecessary roughness calls, you can look around and say, hey, you know what? They blew the whistle really early. You didn't look at this or whatever else. And we'll just flush that. Don't do it again. But something along those lines, where it's a very clear, you smashed a helmet on the ground, that's not something that in any shape, way, or form is ever acceptable. And I think they focus on that to say, we got to clean up these penalties. We got to get back to the basics here, which it can be an issue for a team that is highly based on emotions, which this Laurier squad can be. That's great when you're riding the highs. It can be difficult when you're riding the lows to try to even that your way out there. But certainly something that I think these outstanding coaching staff is going to be focusing on. if I'm looking at this Laurier squad, I'm saying I was hoping for a little bit more out of Tanner Nelms in that run game. Not to say Tanner Nelms wasn't giving his best or whatever else, but finishing with 71 yards against a Waterloo squad that has struggled in the run against some other teams here. I don't think that offensive line is satisfied whatsoever. I think they really want to establish the run here and get back to the basics to really showcase how good Tanner Nelms really is. In a lot of the games that you and I have watched, it takes more than just one dude to get that young man down. Ethan Jordan, Jace Atkinson, Raiden Thorn, Laomi Ojitalayo, Jackson Stebbings. I mean, the receiving core in this Laurier squad is just off. It's nuts. What I'd really like, we know that Ethan Jordan's good. We know that Raiden Thorn is good. We know that Jace Atkinson is good. We know that all these guys are good. I would really love to see Laomi Ojitalayo step into being that true threat downfield and being that real star receiver that he has the complete capabilities that he can. And once again, whenever I'm saying this, I'm not ever implying, oh, he hasn't been trying, because you and I both knew that dude grinds in any way, shape, or form that Coach Galloway asks him to. If you want to put him one-on-one against a DB or a halfback and say, go block that guy so Tanner Nelms can score a touchdown, that dude's running that half 15 yards through the end zone in order to get that job done for his team. I'm saying this young man has the capabilities to be a star receiver in any other scenario on any other team. And I'd love for him to start showing that in the stat game, getting a few more catches, getting a few more opportunities, potentially being that receiver in those wide receiver screens that we have been talking about here, and seeing if he can knife up the field and be a little bit more involved in the passing route for this one. We saw him almost a little bit more involved last year, which seems crazy to think of with all the receivers that are here. But still, I'd love to see him be a little bit more involved in this offense. I truly think that anyone in that receiving core can go off on any single moment, but I'd love to see our guy in Laomi get into the end zone a little bit. Let's see those receiving yards start stacking up and up and up and up.
Laomi, and I know you're listening right now. You might be the next person I throw out there in my fake OUA trades, and Ottawa might be the team I'm sending you to. Obviously, Ottawa just lost one of their key DBs. And I got Hunter Dollywall to the Laurier Golden Hawks, but they certainly have a couple DBs they could probably spare because that second end's so deadly. So they get Laomi, and then what? They give up one of the Cumberbatch brothers. I guess they send Eric. And you know what? Eric, we saw banged up. We got him get hurt. We saw him hurt 2 weeks ago against Queens. I don't think he was playing against Windsor. So, you know, obviously Patrick's the more celebrated of the two. But you know, obviously having that full host of guys in there. But you know, I want to go back to you bringing up Tanner Nelms, because in part and parcel talking about Ottawa's defense, it always comes back to the back end. And you know, hey, Windsor's done this to a lot of teams over the last couple of years. They might have done to my Guelph Griffins even worse, but they'll run the heck out of the ball on you, and they put up 300 yards on the ground against Ottawa. And Tanner Nelms right now, you know, as you said, that Waterloo game, it almost felt a little weird the way they kept going to their air game. And not that it's weird from the standpoint of like, well, why wouldn't you? Like the same way that we talk about when we see Mac, like why would Mac run the ball when you can seemingly, if you can give Hall the time, you can get 5 or 6 guys out there, someone's going to get open and he can just put that dot on anyone. It's kind of like, well, yeah, obviously you have to run the ball at times, but like, so again, similar with Laurier, where it's like, you are so deadly. You highlight all those weapons that they have, Thorn, Jordan, Stebbings, Ojitalayo, all these guys, or Atkinson. But you still have this guy in Nelms who on the year is averaging 102 yards per game. Like he's right there right now, 4th in yards per game behind Donovan Malloy. Malloy, though, in 3 games, though, so the average slightly boosted. So in straight yardage, 3rd in terms of yards that he's been able to accumulate on the ground. Of course, when you have such an effective passing in the game, it's going to open up opportunities in the run just by virtue of the way teams are going to prep for you. By the same token, I want to shout out that Charles Asselin, King Charles Asselin, is number 1 in yards per game, but he also has rushed in 5 games as well. So he's sitting pretty with 618 yards on the ground through those 5 games. To our King, we salute, we bow to you. But I think this is an opportunity where I think for Laurier, you know, in the same way that like we looked at Windsor, and Windsor obviously is a bit of the flip side. Your strength is in the run and pass more selectively. I almost feel like for Laurier, it's been such an emotional whirlwind. I think this would be a cool opportunity for you as a team to be able to have Ottawa come into your house and say, you know what? If we really need to let the horse out of the barn or whatever and just like let rip, we know that Elgersma is ready to go. And obviously, you got to feed him a little bit here and there. But maybe the approach is, and maybe this is where you can get a little creative with a guy like Laomi, because I just want to see him running with a full head of steam at dudes, where you can then say, hey, look, we're going to feed it to Tanner. Nelm's going downhill. We got our guy in Bassick Hayden, who's that big back they have in his ability to just on the short yard situations. And maybe it's a guy like Lay on some fake inside zone jet sweep looks. And now all of a sudden you get big 11. Think he wears number 11. I apologize if I got that wrong. I think he wears 11 Ochslayo. You get him coming around the edge. I got the thumbs up from Tom. And again, just an ability to send a message to the OUA and being able to say, look, you come into our house and you think that you can shut down our passing game. Hey, look, that's totally cool. We're going to show you how we can beat the hell out of you by doing it any which way we want to, because we know that's where you're weakest. And I think that's a sign of not just a well-rounded team. And I got all the love in the world for Coach Galloway as an offensive coordinator, absolutely, and just as a man in general. And I know that he's been able to orchestrate great running attacks. So I don't think of him as someone who's just committed to passing the ball. Again, with that offense, why wouldn't you just want to pass the ball as much as possible? But I think that's such a cool statement you can, as just a badass team, of being able to say, all right, sick. Let's now rush it for 250 yards. And like, you know what? We'll give one of those. And you know what? Maybe Elgersma will have one of those more like Hillock-esque games. Maybe it'll be like 11 for 15, 2 touchdowns. No, you know what I mean? Something like that, that might freak us out a little bit, because it would be so off of his MO of just being that gunslinger, that, Josh Allen type of just trying to let it rip and whatever. Interception, who? I'm just going to go out there. I'm going to throw another one. Pick that one off as well. I'm going to beat you eventually. I'm going to beat you more often than you're going to beat me. And you know what? He has all the reason in the world to believe it. I think it would be neat to see that more well-rounded approach from them. Tom, and again, they have the priors. Nelm's fourth in the league, third in overall rushing yards, right? Brought up the Eric Cumberbatch banged up. Also saw Jahari Hastings out of the last week's game. So obviously those secondaries are a little bit hit with the injury bug. Don't know about everyone in the backfields. What other things are you looking at this game before we put a bow on it and make our picks?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I was just going to say we got corrected by a couple of the Laurier faithful. I believe that on the review pod we mentioned one Johari Hastings. He has been injured since the Western game, so he did not play last week in Waterloo. And once again, I don't know if I've said this before on the pod, but I will say it here. I've found the more and more that I talk to former defensive backs and about the different techniques and just the life of what it means to be a defensive back, there's a lot of similarities between the offensive line and that aspect of you really only get called out if you get torched. Obviously, you still have the capabilities to do a pick six or to do a pass breakup, so there are still positives on that side. But if you get torched, you certainly get brought up a lot. If you get a penalty, you certainly get brought up a lot, like a defensive pass interference or a holding call as an offensive lineman. Even some of the techniques in backing up before you actually make contact with a receiver are similar in certain areas here. So I've always had a bit of a kinship with some of the DBs ever since then as well. And with that, when you look at this defensive secondary with no Jahari Hastings and certainly a Harnu Adaliwal that has had some injury issues in the past, whether that's a hamstring injury or certainly what kept him out in Ottawa, you start looking around being like, oh, wow, if Josh Jansen can really start playing well, is this going to be, is this making its way into being an offensive showcase for Josh Jansen? And then you look at Malik Cote. And that dude has been locked down ever since he has stepped foot on this field with no Jahari Hastings in there. I think he's playing outstanding football. And it's always tough to tell when you have a really good defensive back if you are not live and direct, because if they're really good and they are covering a receiver, that receiver doesn't get the ball, which means there's no camera on that receiver or on that DB. And we have certainly not seen a whole lot of Malik Cote for exactly that reason. I think he's playing outstanding football as it stands right now. And I think he comes up in a big way, whether that's an interception, a key tackle in a certain area. I think he makes his presence felt known amongst the list of other outstanding members on that Laurier defense. Taylor Elgersma and this entire squad flexes their muscles and they do it a little bit cleaner than they have been, limiting those penalties and really making a strong showcase, I'm going with the Golden Hawks in this one.
I'm right there with you. And again, I like that you use the word a cleaner outing because we already kind of jumped forward to it. They have Queens coming to their house the following week. And we certainly know the Queens likes to play a physical brand of football that, like, I can see Elgersma and Hubert maybe taking the gloves off metaphorically or literally and starting to throw bombs at one another, depending on how that goes. So I think again, if this one turns a little chippy as well, and Laurier doesn't seek our advice as we speak it right now, not that they should, because they obviously have forgotten more about the game of football than we'll ever have or ever will learn. But that's certainly been where, if you're going to critique Laurier, it comes in that form of fashion. So let's see if they can rein it in this week against a solid defense. And you know what? I'm with you on the Laurier pick, but I do really, going back to, I think, my first comment there, want to see how this passing attack can start to open up for Ottawa. Aslan, if you're healthy out there, right? And how that helps out Josh Jansen. Speaking of Waterloo Region football, the Warriors are hitting the road to take on, again, another sneaky rival in my Guelph Griffins, your Guelph Griffins, everybody's Guelph Griffins. 1 o'clock from Alumni Stadium. This is a rivalry game that, as a little former offensive lineman from Waterloo, Greg Brand, told me going back about 4 years that Bert has no, well, let's say he hasn't forgotten his opening game as a head coach when, quite truly, it was my last opening day football game back in 2015, dropped, I think, 70 on his head in his OUA head coaching and home debut. So, Bert's up for this. And another little coach on that Waterloo staff is certainly going to be up for this one Kevin McNeil. Have you heard of him? He's the defensive coordinator, former DC and head coach at Guelph, who we really saw last week dive into the playbook, starting to bring those will half fires from the backside, being able to cause a bunch of havoc, rotating his safeties down, seeing his guys like Michael Omaseni make some interceptions when Elgersma was getting picked off or getting pressured and then picking him off. And then we look at Guelph, a team who, you know what? This is a Queens team that defensively, again, if only that defensive front, but again, on all levels, it might be as good as we have in the OUA. That defense is so stellar right now. You put them right up there with Windsor, with Western, and you say, hey, look, they kind of took away any play action opportunities for Guelph because of how effectively they were able to rush the passer. Tristan Boud was made uncomfortable after too long. And obviously, they've been looking through that film. They've been breaking it down and making their adjustments, no doubt. I have to imagine that K-Mac, after what we saw him do against Laurier, and he had all the reason in the world. I mean, obviously, he wants to win that game, but as far as the sort of personal connections to those teams, that he was fired up playing the Golden Hawks, that he's going to come into this one with his defense looking to bring every pressure, every odd blitz, every zone drop, because we certainly saw him throw off Laurier a few times with that. But I'm fired up, though, because I think this is going to be an awesome matchup when we look at how that defense has been starting to fire and how head coach, and offensive coordinator Mark Soria has been creative with his offense and now seeing and scouting each other. I think there's some really nifty things we're going to see, like in the proverbial metaphorical chess match between McNeil and Soria. I think we're going to see some cool things that come Sunday when we're breaking this thing down. We're going to be like, they did this and then they did that. And I don't think I've ever seen like all these types of like these creative people calling these plays, which again is what makes this league so dynamic right now. I am so stoked for. Obviously, there's other areas of the game that we have to talk about, but from that standpoint, McNeil's homecoming, his opening up the playbook and getting creative with his blitzes, and just as we keep seeing Coach Soria diversify his offense with the bevy of weapons, that's where my mind goes to with this matchup. What are you thinking about, Tom?
I love that you brought that up because exactly that. I think we've seen so much of the Coach McNeil in previous, we've talked about it a lot about what he was doing at Guelph and how he was really commanding that defense. And now finally against Laurier, we really think that we saw the true iteration of what he can do with that defense. And you know that he's going to be sending unconventional pressures. You know that he's going to be sending those will half blitzes, which can be such a pain in the butt to block and to really be able to account for, especially when it's overload pressure. But once again, if you can if you can find the gaps that are created when somebody blitzes, that can be a long day in that regard. So it's really going to be a chess match going back and forth with the two of them. I look at this in particular, and once again, I'm an offensive lineman at heart. If we don't talk about the O-line, no one
Nobody
will.
will.
Looking at this Guelph Griffin O-line, once again, we've already talked about how good they are, but when you look at all of the teams that they have played, both defensive schemes and players, you kick off the year in one of the best edge rushers that there can be against a Onyeka in the first game of the season. You then play against a Toronto team that is admittedly still finding their way and finding their groove, but you play against Laurier with an outstanding defense in that regard, just fairly for the most part straight up in the defense, or at least from what we've seen, a few blitzes here and there. A McMaster team that sends blitzes like crazy and a very unconventional. We used to call it when we played against Coach Brady in 2014, and he was the defensive coordinator, head coach at Mount Allison. We called his defense a bunch of dancing bears because they were walking around doing everything that they were doing, trying to confuse us in that regard. And he's brought that essence to McMaster. And then obviously going up against, we just detailed it earlier, arguably the best group unit, period, in all of U Sports in the Queens Golden Gales defensive line here. So this squad has seen a whole bunch of stuff happening, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a couple of wrinkles that Coach K-Mac throws their way, and you got Coach Mike McDonald going, son of a, okay, all right, we got to go back to the drawing board. Let me draw something up real quick at halftime so that we know how to block that up properly. So I'm really interested to see how he's going to try and get after either Tristan Aboud or Marshall McRae against a very stout offensive line here. We're still not seeing Kane Stevenson in that Queens game. He was banged up against Mac. He wasn't in there last time. Vashon Janus is back and really showcasing his stuff. Willem Arsenault is playing outstanding as well for this passing attack. And we've seen flashes of brilliance from Tristan Aboud in that passing game. When he's on target, when he has time in the backfield, he can pick apart damn near any defensive secondary that's back there. But there have been times where you and I've detailed before, some of those passes are behind his receivers. Some of them are a bit off the mark in certain cases. And certainly if he's got pressure in his face, it's very hard for any quarterback in any league to be really effective if you have that. So I want to see, how effective is this passing game really going to be? How effective is Tristan Aboud going to be against a defense in Waterloo that will send pressure, that will send blitzes? And if they're sending a will half on the backside, you think, oh, there's a massive gap there. That safety's rotating down, just waiting to pick off a ball when you think, oh, I can just throw something in here and be safe for that one. So really interested to see what that chess match between these two coordinators is going to look like.
And I love that, like, before the pod, you and me were just having a quick little like convo about like slide protection rules on the offensive line. Because to what you're saying as well, like what came with K-Mac and the way he'll bring those overload blitzes is that he'll drop a defensive end into coverage as well. So if you're on, the left hash and he's bringing his boundary two off that one side, even if you're sliding into it, and even if you account for it, he's dropping that field side end into coverage, kind of making your right tackle on air, having no assignment there unless you're accounting for it. But then no doubt if they're going to do a full slide, then they're going to, account for that and read. And just like, again, now that this defense is having that familiarity with the system, and a guy like you mentioned, like in the back end at the safety position, guys like Anesu Latmore, who we've seen really effectively get into the box and rush the passer. I think it was against Ottawa. He got 2 sacks in that game, which is outstanding for a safety defensive back player like himself. So just, again, sort of from that impartial standpoint, so exciting to see. And just, I feel like we've gone back to that piece on gratitude and gratefulness in general. And just as far as Guelph having seen it all, you look through their schedule And we're getting to that point now in the season where, 7 teams are going to make it. Home field advantage is still on the line for a lot of these teams. They're hosting Waterloo. And obviously, again, the same way we set up that Laurier game. If you just want to look at it cleanly and just say, oh, Waterloo, Guelph, okay, give me Guelph. I'm not going to think about it. And it shouldn't surprise anyone. I'll spoil it now. I'm taking Guelph at home in this one. But you look the following week for Guelph, they host Windsor. And obviously, we know what they do offensively, but that's a Coach Donovan defense that's going to bring all sorts of noise. Then they finish on the road against a defense that is as familiar for them as it is for me because of the times we matched up with Coach Knox with the York Lions. They get the last week bye, and it just feels like they need to just, like, we talk about the amount of mental fortitude that Laurier's having to show with the stretch of games they're having. We went into the season looking at that last week bye for Guelph and being like, you know what? Take care of your business. And then you get that extra little break. It'd be a surprise to a lot of folks if you ended up with that first seed and got that bye as well. So, you get a bye going into the playoffs and you're rested. But that means you have to fight through so many slings and arrows and injuries, as you mentioned with Kane Stevens. And I'm certain some other folks who I'm not remembering off the top of my head, to be able to get to that point that I think is going to be so crucial for them. Let's flip the script a little bit. We're talking about the offense and defense for Guelph compared to the Waterloo defense. For Waterloo offensively and what Guelph's been showing us defensively, we were able to see. And hey, look, Jared Kasari is going to get his on the ground against anyone. I don't think you go back to that and you say, wow, what a letdown on the ground. Kasari, obviously, it wasn't even his best game. But again, it's a bit of a wash, right? In some instances, we were looking at how Vrieken was able to get some of these strikes downfield. And that game against Laurier, what I think we shared in our commentary with what excited us about Waterloo was we've seen some really high highs from Nick Orr. We've seen, I don't even want to say low lows, but we've seen when when they have the rushing attack going and when Anthony Miller and Quentin Springer are really rearing behind a solid veteran O-line, that he can just, Nick Orr, that is, be just, okay, selective, hand the ball off, pick and choose your spots. But that Laurier game where they went to that formula of, kind of as we've talked about with Laurier a little bit, we're going to take our shots. We're going to send out with Samuel Slocum, whether it's Tyler Tierney, right? Whether it's Evan Basiliga, and we might not connect on all of them, but we'll get you on some of these chunk plays. And from how we've seen some teams, obviously Keegan Hall was able to have success, but again, hey, look, Keegan Hall's scored touchdowns on me, and I've never even played defensive back, right? And Alex Vrieken and all these things, right? They've played great quarterbacks, but we've seen that teams have been moving the ball downfield on them, sometimes with some of those chunk plays. And I have that suspicion that Waterloo might take that same approach in this one, hitting the road, a rival team, and trying to say, look, we've seen a few teams, obviously what Elgersmo was able to do at times with them. Let's take our shots. Screw it. Throw caution to the wind. We're the underdog going into their house. We're going to come in throwing haymakers. We know our defense is going to be really solid here and cause them some headaches. Let's take our shots. Let's try and get them to back up. Let's feed Miller. Let's feed Springer. We started to see that run game come together a little bit. Miller had a really strong game against Ottawa. Springer, we saw him get the touchdown last week. A couple really electric plays. So that well-rounded component of the offense is coming together. But I have a hunch, and again, they have one of the best young coordinators in Coach Conway calling up for them. And like we've talked about with so many of these guys, he can get creative with the best of them to recognize here's where we have advantages, so on and so forth. But I feel like that a bit of that philosophy, because that's what we've been wanting to see. What is this philosophy? What is this 2024 Waterloo offense looking like? Because it's not the 23 offense. That offense just pounded the rock, by hook or by crook, live by the sword, die by the sword, whatever it is. We haven't quite figured that out, but I feel like we've seen a few times now where they're like, hey, you know what? As we were saying, let's take a few looks downfield, try and get those chunk plays that, again, can be a bit demoralizing at times for the defense. You say, oh, where was the bust? You're trying to figure out, and before maybe they're handing it back off to Springer, breaking a run to the outside. Don't think we fully solidified in terms of what that philosophy is, but what do you think Waterloo is going to come into this game looking to execute and looking to take advantage as far as what we've seen from these two clubs, as far as Waterloo's offense and Guelph's defense?
Well, I think if you're looking at the Guelph defense, if you want to say what's the weakest part. And when I say weakest, I don't mean bad. I just mean what's the part that's not as good as everything else is. And I think you'd be consistently saying, well, the defensive secondary certainly has some question marks associated with it. Certainly from all of the struggles that they had last year and then going into this year and some of the losses that we've seen, sometimes some of those folks have gotten burned a little bit. So if I'm Waterloo going into this one, I'm saying we've gotten Nick Orr in a spot where he feels confident in throwing the ball and that he's really started to see some success. Let's get back to that. Let's get back to really starting to establish that. For a fun little look into history here, last year, the Waterloo Warriors were able to beat Guelph for the first time since at least 2011. I didn't go further back than that, but it was the first time in a very long time that Waterloo has been able to top Guelph in that. And even some of the stats here, Tristan Aboud, 9 for 17 for 88 yards and 1 interception. Nick Orr, 5 for 15, 103 yards, 1 touchdown, but a long of 68, which means if you take that away, he's 4 for 14 for 35 yards. Not exactly what we've seen from both of these squads in this passing attack going into this year. And then obviously when you look at the running game, Donovan Malloy, 16 attempts for 161 yards. That's very doable still. I think he's still got the capabilities for that. But Anthony Miller on the other side, 28 attempts, 232 yards on the ground and 1 touchdown. That really showcases Waterloo really leaning on the run here and Guelph really struggling against the run as we saw last year. It's funny enough because while there have been obviously a couple of key pieces that are missing from both of these squads, whether injuries through Guelph or guys like James Basiliga and Justin Sukar who are graduating, 2 completely different mindsets going into this game rather than just a year ago, with a Waterloo attack that looks very much like a passing first kind of offense rather than the run first that we saw just last year, and a Tristan Aboud and a Marshall McRae who are 1 year vastly improved in an offense where they really seem to be gelling and clicking here. So I think both offenses are really going to start coming alive. I think if you're Nick Orr, you are trying to make sure that you are smart with the football as always, certainly. But like you mentioned, go for those big bombs. Go and test those Guelph defensive backs here. Get a James Basiliga, get some of your guys out there to really see, hey, even if we don't connect in this, even if worst case it's an interception, it still acts as something of a punt because it's way downfield. And also that defensive secondary is now hyper aware that Nick Orr's got the arm. He can really test us downfield. We better respect that, which will then open up a whole bunch in the middle as well. So I'm really looking to see the evolution of Nick Orr even into this year. I think he's been getting better and better and better in certain games here. I think he takes another big step in this one and showcases some real bright spots for a Waterloo offense that has admittedly been struggling this year.
Yeah, definitely. And it's such an interesting game to look at, their matchup from last year, as obviously highlight Waterloo wins. And I can't remember exactly how it broke down, but it was a bit of a wild finish. Crossset, I think, hits a game winner. Again, I didn't dive all into the details of that one. And then looking at, of course, how these two teams have opened up the campaigns at about the midway point of this season, with Waterloo still looking to pick up a win and Guelph at times looking like, at least on the offensive end, they're the best in the business. But you brought up how Waterloo was able to run the ball on them last year. You know, hey, look, that was an unfortunate trend we were seeing at times. And in the passing game too, obviously it's set off a few alarms for us this year as well. But you go back to, you know, a game like that Laurier game last year where Elgersma scores the 6 touchdowns and, you know, no thank you. But this year, in terms of the rushing attack, Guelph's actually been limiting the second fewest amount of yards on the ground, second to Windsor, which, hey, you gotta love that when you're in that kind of company sandwiched between them and Queens. On the flip side, though, in terms of passing yards they're giving up in the air, they're giving up the second most in the air. And part of that story to me is that they're not getting to the quarterback. 4 sacks for them on the day, on the year. And you look at, you know, your Lauriers of the world with 12, Queens has 10, Windsor with 11, Carlton, Mac with 9. Ottawa, a team that we've been, Ottawa and Western. Ottawa and Western with 7 apiece. Two teams that we have consistently over the last year and change come back to saying, hey, look, who's that pass rusher extraordinaire? Your back end super frisky, your linebackers are solid. Who's getting after the quarterback? And so, yeah, like it's one of those things again where the stat falls on the secondary often when you're saying, oh, look, you have the second most passing yards in the air. It's like, well, hey, if we can talk about coverage sacks, we can certainly talk about, I don't know what you'd call the reverse, but a clean pocket, big play downfield. We'll come up with a sort of snippy term for that or whatever. Because again, that's certainly going to give, any quarterback, let alone a guy like Nick Orr, who on top of, what that gives you with a clean pocket, but we've seen this guy with the escapability too, and making off platform throws that, I think that's where we really need to see it step up from just generally the passing defense from Guelph, but not just putting on the secondary, their ability to rush the passer. Tom, I love the angles we've looked at. I love from the personal standpoint with K-Mac, with Coach Burt and their feelings about the Guelph Griffins and all these things, and Guelph both coming off emotional losses. Any stones unturned? Are you ready for a pick? Because I made mine. So
Yeah, yeah, I'll get into this as well. And something that I wanted to point out in that, once again, the idea that stats do not tell the full story in this one. And I've been guilty of this as well, and just going in, oh, look at the yards per game, look at this, look at that. When you detail the passing yards being the second most in the OUA, certainly something that Guelph needs to work on. But you look at the teams that they've played against so far. You've got Elijah Barnes and Tristan
Lefebvre, yeah.
Lefebvre, excuse me. Tristan Lefebvre was still healthy in that first game in Carleton. Good. You've got Caleb O'Donohue in the next game. You've got Taylor Elgersma, Keegan Hall, and then an Alex Vreeken that finally found his stride and was able to throw the ball just last week. Arguably, you'd say the teams that are at the bottom of the OUA in terms of a passing offense, Waterloo, Windsor, and York, not in that order, they have yet to play. So is this defensive secondary really a liability, or have they just been playing the top passing attacks so far in the season? So when you look at that, I think this Guelph squad is going to come in and they're going to do some really great things. It's Guelph homecoming as well, which always adds a little bit of extra fire, especially if that entire hillside is packed with people. Woo-hoo-hoo. We've talked about some great environments, certainly in the OUA. There's a lot of debate. People can go back and forth. With my experience personally, there is no better atmosphere than playing in Guelph for their homecoming when you're on all sides. You've got chirping happening at you, and those stands and the hill is packed. For all of those things and more, I'm going with your Guelph Griffins, my Guelph Griffins, everyone's Guelph Griffins in this one.
Man, do other leagues actually think they're better than the OUA? You're just talking about that quarterback play, like
you can't. You just can't be. I know that the RCQ has some outstanding quarterbacks, and Mr. Sanacala and Desjardins and Jackson Tuchinski and Rooker and everybody else out west. But top to bottom, when you've got a U of T squad that is struggling and still has Caleb O'Donohue slinging the rock, come on. Come on, this is the best conference in U Sports.
We roll 11 deep, baby. It's the best. Well, going from the Royal City to the nation's capital, we move to our 4:00 game with the York Lions having earned their first stripe, going to take on the Carleton Ravens. Both these teams coming off of emotional games. York obviously pulling out the Battle of Toronto, the Red and Blue Bowl, the Argo Cup, the Matt Deans Bowl in exciting fashion in the finale of that one. Carleton with the near miraculous comeback against your McMaster Marauders. For both these teams, or let's start with the Carleton piece of it, because I think what was so exciting, and again, it feels like an error to look on the stands, and much like we did talking about Queens and Western, right now Carleton's looking up at York, right? Been a while, been a few moons since they had done that. It feels like a typo seeing them sitting at 1-4 on the season. We love what Elijah Barnes is doing. Obviously, we know coming into the year, Kasim Ferdinand is one of the best in the business. We obviously knew that Tristan Reddy and guys like Frederick Hatchie were really solid as um, that support in the past game, but Reddy has really made his claim for, an OUA All-Star bid in this year. And hey, like if he keeps it up, maybe even more on the year. But looking at last week against a MAC defense that, hey, we are very bullish on seeing with no Matthew Morin, a guy like Ethan Roca
Mhm.
bust off 130 on the ground. A guy in Keyshawn Reed who had his welcome to the OUA moment the week prior against U of T with a kickoff return touchdown. I believe it was a kickoff, not a punt. He's able to piece together 66 on the ground. And yeah, Elijah Barnes still goes 16 for 27, 239, the one interception, two touchdowns. And again, context matters. The one interception, tip ball, ends up in the hands of 13, Josh Cumber. And the last interception, you know what? He's trying to tie the game up near the end of the game or maybe take the lead. Just, hey, doesn't connect with Kasim trying to score the touchdown. Pressure moment. We talked about he showed his age perhaps a little bit. He's going to learn how to win those games tight. Again, I think you and I are as big of fans of this young man as we could be, but more so again with how effective that rushing attack was and using a lot of that read option look, taking advantage of Barnes' athleticism. Talk about clubs that are putting together a more well-rounded approach. This Carleton offense is looking so spectacular. And they're going up against the defense with your guy, Coach Knox, who, again, you mentioned the Coach Brady dancing bear front. I think we use similar terms and talk about some of the things that Knox would do. And he showed some of those looks against U of T with two ends, then everyone else is just kind of all over the place. This will be a really neat test for this Carleton offense because despite the lack of wins coming their way and a lot of tight losses, we've certainly seen them produce offensively. This is a really interesting test against the team that's going to throw Elijah Barnes. Yeah, he had to deal with Mac, he had to deal with other strong teams, perhaps some of the most odd fronts and blitz packages that he'll have probably ever seen in his football life.
When you look at this Carleton Ravens squad and you look at all of the trials and tribulations and everything they have gone through in this season so far, they're sitting at 1-4. And like you said, in no way, shape, or form does that make any sense to either of us. I would argue that when you're looking at this, it could very easily have been a 3-2, maybe even a 4-1 if everything goes well for you in the home opener against Guelph. Although with a new Guelph squad, I think it's a little, I think that you still, whatever, but still very easily could have been 3-2, completely controlling your own destiny at this point here, if not for a couple of bounces against the Windsor Lancers and the McMaster Marauders in this one. So for a Carleton Ravens squad going into this game, there's got to be a lot of anger and a lot of disappointment and a lot of whatever, but still, you still have a fairly decent area to be a part of here. You still control your own destiny. If you win out, this is a 4-4 year. And that's a great spot to be in, middle of the pack. Maybe even the way that things work out with a 7 team, you might even get a playoff, a home game in that regard. There's a lot of things that need to go into play, but you've got Laurier at the end of the season. And if Laurier is still fighting to make sure that they get a first round bye, you might get the best of the best here. So every single win that you get between now and then is going to be an important one. Obviously, you want to win every game no matter what, but now you start looking into the grand scheme of things on playoff settings and how that looks. So this is going to be a big one for them. When you look at a Greg Knox defense, first and foremost, I don't know what it is about that man, but he hates when teams run the ball against him. He stops the run first and foremost. That's what he trains his defense to do, and get that offense into second and long and into obvious passing scenarios where he can let loose, get his guys on blitzes, start showing those funky fronts that you saw a little bit in U of T, and really get ball hawks to go after that ball and to get turnovers. That's what his MO has been. That's how he likes to play defense first. So I don't think you're going to see the same level of production from Ethan Roca in this one. I still think that young man is going to do some great things. I don't know that he goes for as many yards in this game that he did against Mac, but Elijah Barnes really feels to get better and better and better as things go on. And because he's just a second year player here and really getting his first taste of game experience, that getting better and better is not just inching forward, he's taking leaps and bounds in a lot of cases. His play that we saw in week 1 against Guelph compared to what we're seeing now is vastly different and vastly improved. And I think that this young man is really going to do some great things here. I think that Kasim Ferdinand is really playing lights out. And Tristan Reddy is another outstanding receiver who seems to get better and better and better as things go on here. So I like this Carleton Ravens squad in this one. And you're almost you got to look at them and say, hey, listen, guys, at some point in time, those bounces, those jump balls that we like to refer to in football, you got to start winning those. If you want to actually get out of this and want to make sure that you finish with more than just one win on the season, you have to start winning those jump balls. And I think that's really what the focus is going to be going into this one.
Most definitely. And again, like it's the Carleton team where, like, and again, just goes back to the point of how competitive, how tough this OUA season is. Cause, you get that win against Toronto. And other than that, they're dealing with the Macs, the Guelphs, the Westerns of the world. That Windsor team they were so formidable with. And of course, in that Western game, remembering it was like as bad a start to the game as you could have. And this young kid in Barnes is still marching the ball down the field. So just like the level of excellence in spite of the losses coming their way is truly commendable. On the York side of the ball, right? They pick up that win, and it's one of those games where we do this sometimes in looking at production of quarterbacks. But I'm going to play this game and just looking at the production of the offense as a whole, because they net 266 yards against U of T in that one. You have a 75-yard rush by Avante McCoy. I mean, you take that away from just the rushing yards they had alone, it takes them under 100 yards on the day. Again, as an offense, they really didn't get too much going. It was very start and stop at times. Matt Lynn on the whole goes 11 for 25, no touchdowns, one interception against U of T, 103 in the air. Malchus Alunga gets 12 carries, but only 26 yards as a result of that. And, it was interesting again with Dakota on his familiarity with these teams and specifically with guys like McCoy and like Alunga. It does seem like using them as sort of these more versatile backs, McCoy in specific. He used the I forget the analogy he used, but kind of being like a guy that, he's in the backfield, he's out, you can motion him in, you can give him a jet sweep. The way, like, we know our guys that we talk about this with, the Liam Talbots, the Charles Aslan types that we've seen so effectively. We can hand the ball off and get them the ball in space. But against the UFC team defensively that hasn't, we really liked what they were doing last year at times. And of course, Coach Bob Mullen with the best coach swag in the league, like what they've shown. But, this year, it really hasn't been that knock your socks off with. So looking at how they're going to move the ball against Carleton is certainly something that, much like with Waterloo in Guelph and in all their games, where forming that identity, where we're seeing them start to stake their claim. We're seeing it a little more so on the defensive side, as you mentioned with Coach Knox, and that makes sense because he kind of comes with not just a known presence, but a known, as you mentioned, first and foremost, we stop the run. We're going to do some of these different fronts. We're going to bring a lot of pressure. We're going to make you think on the line so you can't just fly off the ball and execute your blocks. Hey, you get that when you get a guy like Knox off the jump, forming their identity. And again, despite they pick up the win, I don't know if I came out of that U of T game being like, I know what this York team does at its best on offense. And I don't know if we've seen that yet. And last thing I'll say is, in large part, that's probably also a product of the fact that it looks like they might not be playing with Alfred Olay now for a little bit. And knowing that he's in his 7th year at the school, it's heartbreaking to think if we don't get to see him out there with the York Lions again. But that to me is where it just, it just takes away so much of the versatility they're able to conjure up, where a guy who has made his bones and just saying, give me the ball in space and I'll make some magical things happen. On top of that, a good Carlton defense, and one that's been banged up as well. We brought up the fact that you know L. James Igamudo in the mix for them, no Otman Braun. Hopefully those guys are getting healthy. York on offense, like what is the thing you think they have to be doing to move the ball downfield? We've seen flashes of it in the backfield. We've seen flashes of it with Matt Lynn, with some of these receivers, Avery Ford and the like, against this Carlton defense that's really fast. And a guy with Chris Tupen and Xavier Malone, all these guys, and Ife Onyeka, like literally, how are they going to move the ball against this Carlton team?
It's difficult to say in this regard because I don't know that they have their rhythm on offense whatsoever. You know, they were able to get the job done against the U of T squad, and we had Dakota Vion to really talk and really hammer home the fact of how important this was to the program and to all of these players, certainly. But like you mentioned, I didn't come out of that being like, oh, this is what York's offense looks like. This is how they move the ball down the field. This is what they like to do at all. I think it's more so a testament to the outstanding players that they have rather than the scheme that was working or anything else from that regard. I mean, when you look at some of the stats for Mr. Matt Lynn on the year, so far he's 50 for 100, 579 yards, one touchdown, four interceptions, and he's been sacked 11 times.
Hmm.
So obviously having some difficulties there. Now, not all of that is on the offensive line. You and I know that Matt Lynn likes to take off and run with it as well. There's been a couple of times where he's been caught behind the line of scrimmage, but having a guy who gets sacked as much as he does, which is number one in the OUA right now, against the number one leading sack getter in U Sports right now, which is Mr. Onyeka with 7, not exactly a great combination to be getting into this. So there's a lot of things here that is going against the York Lions offense as it stands right now. I think the real key for York to be successful on offense is the defense has to play their best ball that they have so far this year. I think that York Lions defense has got to consistently get York with positive, if not favorable, field position starting off, getting into this one, win that field position battle, getting a few turnovers most definitely, and setting them up in that regard. I think that's really what's going to be the key in this one. I don't have consistent faith in the York Lions offense as it stands. I have faith in Avante McCoy, most definitely. I've got faith in Alfred Olay, but if Mr. Olay is out, that's a massive part to that offense. Melkus Alunga is still, I think we've seen flashes once again, but I still think that he can get going here. But still, I'm just not confident in this York Lions offense as it stands right now. And like I mentioned previously, I don't know what they're going to choose to really lean on here, whether it's the run game, pass game, or a combination between the two to get things done, because we just haven't seen it so far.
Yeah. And you know what? I don't think we need to overthink this one too much. Especially because again, they're going into Carlton as well. So you get the long trip in the mix. And I'll add in too, you know, one thing that has been really solid for York and on no better example than against U of T is Nathan Walker punting the heck out of the ball. But frankly, I'm saying that to say that Tristan Reddy, Kasim Ferdinand, one of those two is going to take one to the crib with, you know, if he's going to outkick the coverage as you understand a concept you understand so intimately, Tom. Hey, I'm picking Carlton in this one. Again, I expect their offense to be flourishing the way it has been. That defense has been great. Again, such an odd season when we look at when we look at just the way they've been just firing all cylinders and yet haven't picked up the wins. They're picking up the win here at home in my books. Tom, you with me on this one?
Yeah, it's Carlton at home in this one, getting their second win of the year.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to our final game from one end of the 401 to the other. We get U of T heading to Windsor under the golden arches, the blue collar, the gold swagger. Windsor coming off of that. Just, I mean, we have the two other teams coming off of massive plays. Windsor against Ottawa, the final seconds, and then U of T with Sam Henke kicking perhaps as fine an onside kick as we've seen, I've seen at any level, and UFC is not able to corral the ball. Windsor, it looks like they're sticking with Danny Skelton, had a really solid performance. Liam Talbot healthy, that Russian attack looking good. Wavy Mambo out of the mix, and that defense still really solid. For UFT, we can kind of repeat a lot of that commentary. Obviously, seeing Scott Barnett go down a couple weeks ago, it very much looks like it's Caleb O'Donoghue's show now. And with some of those running backs they have in the mix that have had good days here and there, you match that up against a Windsor defense, and yikes, this is going to be tough for them. Let's start with the UFT offensive side of things, because we've certainly seen how at times against really good coordinators, because pretty much every week you're playing a really good coordinator. We've seen them offensively get a little creative here and there and just give their guys opportunities to make plays. We've seen Chris Joseph be fantastic all year. We've seen Jacob Seen have fantastic outings, though, again, I don't know his health status, but he took the pads off. He was in a sling in that last game. So that's obviously not looking good. What do you make of UFT trying to prep for a team in Windsor that, can play you straight up and without doing anything too creative, and just with the talent they have at every single level, give you nightmares?
Looking into this game, looking into this week, when you look at all of the different coordinators, different position groups, and different offense versus defensive kind of mentalities here, I don't know that there's a bigger challenge to any one team than this Toronto offense against this Windsor defense. I think that this Windsor defense is poised and has been really showcasing some outstanding stuff. It's taken Kaladia Moosin a little bit longer than it did last year for him to really get going here, but he's showcased that he's still the guy to be looking out for, with a couple of sacks in the last game. Certainly no Mufta Gelly, but with the rotation of guys that they have in there, with the fact that Ethan John, Devin Verisuk, and the rest of that outstanding defensive, the linebacking core in the secondary is playing as well as they are, I think this is a very big challenge for the U of T Blues going into this one. Now, with that, I'm still am very excited about Caleb O'Donoghue and the capabilities that this young man has. I mean, when you look at his capabilities that he has, and when you look at Christopher John, I think that if you start utilizing Christopher John once again in that same kind of Liam Talbot, Charles Aslan type in that regard, where you're getting him on jet sweeps, where you're getting him out of the backfield, and then you're just getting him in space with nobody else around him for him to turn on the jets and really get things going, especially if one Jake Oseen is out for you as well. I think this is a massive ask for anybody to go into and say, okay, go win this game for us without two of your star receivers, or at least one of your star receivers in Jake Oseen in this one. So I'm really interested to see what Coach Kaniches is going to dial up against a very stout Windsor defense. I'd be shocked if we didn't see a little bit more Jack Nyros, Garrett Ellis in this game, and to really establish the run and try to, against the Windsor squad, to take a little bit of pressure off of Caleb. But this is as tough of a challenge as one coordinator is going to face.
Yeah, and you know what? Like I was literally just pulling up the stats as you were saying that, and yeah, they've had their bye already for Windsor, but just looking at them having given up 54 points, averaging 13.5, just a shade over 100 yards on the ground per game. They're sacking the quarterback, even like taking into account, as you said, that Kaladi hasn't really had, that explosive dynamic game as he had last year. Robert Springer in the back end, I don't have it in front of me now. He must be leading, if not tied. I'm thinking of guys like Keegan Vanek or Miller Melanson, who might be in the same ballpark with him in terms of interceptions. So like the way we talk about that, we talk about that whole piece on, maybe run the ball to soften up the back end, or start throwing it downfield to open up that run game. Like, this is a Windsor team where, again, they don't seemingly need to adjust for anything for you in terms of where they need to budge. It's such a impressive feat. And again, what Coach Donovan's doing there with these guys, and your Ethan Johns and your Devin Verisuks, your Jason Rashatsis, like what an outstanding defense this is for them. So like again, I threw that question out to you, and maybe it goes back to the screen game looks that we've seen Chris Joseph in space, but it's gonna be interesting. Again, this is one of those situations where it like whatever success U of T has offensively, and maybe that's kind of gonna be their MO, where it's gonna be like, hey, they're gonna just kind of just adjust and be creative and try to steal an edge here and there. But wherever they are gonna find success in this game, I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat of being like that specifically is what U of T does best as anyone else, aside from just that it being a product of adjusting, right? Because however you're going to try and move the ball against Windsor is by getting creative, is by doing a little chicanery, of by doing the old look over here while we're doing a little something over here with a misdirection. So again, I think it's going to be creative, but if Jake Ocean's not in there as well, like just that, it's so limiting for them. Talk about some of those guys on Windsor. We talk about how for Danny Skelton going into that game last week against Ottawa with that back end of the defense being so formidable and just saying, hey, look, like let your rushing attack do what it's got to do, be methodical, be take advantage of the opportunities you get. And obviously that game-winning drive he put together was chef's kiss, beautiful for Skelton in a team going up against a team in U of T where it's not as tall a task as Ottawa. Like, do you want them just to stick with that plan of saying like, look, that's our identity? We talk about this thing of like, do you just establish your identity? For years we always knew Western's going to run power G, they're going to do their play action shots downfield, they're going to play that 4-3 defense, play sound, and look, they don't need to adjust when they do things, and obviously they do make adjustments, but just their play so solid. For Windsor, do you just continue to say, here's our identity, here we are, y'all know what we do, but we do it as good as anyone else? Or is this an opportunity now where they can say, all right, hey, Danny, like, let's give you a few more opportunities here? Because we've certainly seen game, like they've also been willing to pull the hook on him at a few times. What do you want to see from them offensively, specifically when it comes to Danny Skelton, a guy they flip-flopped with a little bit going back to even last year?
If you're a team like a Western Mustangs who has an identity, who has something to lean on, like that power G run game, you're not as likely to take out a player if they're not playing as well as you hope for, or rather really just hammer on what you do as well as anybody else until it starts working. You beat it into submission here. I think the fact that Danny Skelton has been pulled out as many times as he has been in just the past year and a half or so showcases to me that the Don, Coach Cercelli here, is willing to do whatever it takes and put anybody who's in there to give them the best chance at winning football games. And I don't know that they have one particular thing that they say, this is what we're going to lean on, this is who we are, no matter what, this is what we're doing. I think even just seeing the evolution of one Joey Zorn and going from a breakout star in 2022 as being that bell cow as a running back to now seeing him in a slot receiver and seeing him get out for a couple passes and see him start to develop himself into something of a dual threat as well. I think that showcases the evolution of what this Windsor offense is really trying to go for. I'd love to see Liam Talbot get more and more involved into this pass game as well, into this offense in general. I know that he's been injured and kind of been on and off here, but I truly think that he's got the same level of versatility that a Charles Aslan has if you're able to get him the ball in key scenarios. We saw that previously with something like a jet pass, an outside screen to him, and just getting him the ball in space and letting him do his thing. He's really outstanding in the things that he does. Obviously, a very key component of the win that they had against that Ottawa GG's team just last week. So I'd like to see Liam Talbot get a little bit more established into the offense here. And maybe that's just a lack of, like I said, he was injured and hasn't been playing, but a little bit more into that. The run game, for the most part, hasn't been jump off the page, oh my God, this is amazing as of yet. And Granted, it's being spread amongst three very good backs, so maybe that's another factor into why we're not really wowed at a lot of things here. But even with that, we saw some outstanding games. I don't like to bring it up, but against your Guelph Griffins last year, as well as a big showcase for that. But we haven't seen that level of production going into this year so far from any one of the three, with still a lot of question marks around Wegby Mambo in terms of his health and how he is doing. I don't know how this offense continues to evolve, at least in the way that it has been. To me, I think your best bet into continuing to make sure that you are utilizing all of the weapons that you have here is, I think Danny Skelton is still your guy. I think he was able to do enough, certainly at the end of the game last week, in order to get Liam Talbot that ball and to win you the game. Arguing what to say, during the middle piece of it, certainly, but Skelton has showcased that in certain areas he is able to win games, and I think that's your best asset right now. If Wegby Mumbo is still out, you have a two-headed monster in Christopher John and Joey Zorn being able to run the ball to keep everybody fresh while you're doing that. And the threat at slot receiver has got to be Liam Talbot, and really just establishing him and getting him going as well. And maybe with, once again, a couple of deep balls that, even if they don't connect, give Liam Talbot in that, just lighten up that defensive front seven just a little bit to create some more run lanes and to create some more gaps for your guys.
Definitely. And it's similar with, like, you look at teams like Carleton and Mac, where they're so spectacular and throwing the ball downfield. And yeah, for Windsor, you're probably right, because they don't just lean on one singular guy. It's perhaps easy to take advantage how incredible that rushing attack is. Tom, they still lead the league in their average in rushing the ball. But yeah, you mentioned some of those shots downfield. Obviously, guys like Colby Ginn, Javoni Cunningham, Jalen Miller, those are guys there that can make those big plays for you. But in the comparison with, Carlton Mack was going to make, is like, where you look at in terms of points per game, it's odd where you're so good offensively and you're not always executing. I checked the red zone efficiency. It's not even that they're not converting there, but it's probably a few more too many times going to old Brady Litster to score those points than getting it in the end zone. Best rushing attack in terms of average, only 3 rushing touchdowns though. So again, figuring out how to end up with 6 instead of 3s at the end of drives is, I think, what you have to make sure you're doing in this game, and figuring out what those plays are. Going back to that piece on identity, when we're within the 20, we're within the 10, on second, on first, whatever the situation is, what are we best at to be able to get the ball into the end zone, so we're not settling for that. And with a game at Guelph coming up the next week, with a game against Windsor and against Western and Laurier, or sorry, flip that, Laurier and Windsor to close out the season, got to take advantage of this opportunity against the last definitively lesser opponent than you right now. Yeah, I'll give them the edge against Guelph, as well. But U of T is the last team the last non-playoff team, in all likelihood, you're facing. Get yourself sorted out. Figure out again what your identity is, where you're excellent. Figure out how to get the ball in the end zone with 6s and not 3s. And make sure guys are healthy. And again, not knowing Wegby Mambo's status, but again, knocking on wood that he's all good. Tom, I'm certainly going to go with the Don Coach Cercelli at home under the Golden Arches against U of T. Unless there's anything else there, I'd love to hear your pick on this one, though I don't think you'll be surprising me here.
No, I'm certainly not surprising you. I hesitate to ever pick against the coach Don Cercelli, and I'm not doing it in this one either. It's going to be the Windsor Lancers to win this. I would love to see Windsor establish the pass game, establish that offense, and to continue to see the growth of this Windsor defense into being close to, if not the number 1 defense in all of the land. If Windsor wants to get to the end of the road where they're hosting playoff games and teams have to go through the end of the 401 if you want to get to where you want to go, that is a vastly huge advantage for the Windsor Lancers, rather than them having to travel here. So they're undefeated. Right now, they are one of, I believe, 5 teams in the entire country that are still undefeated. So I think they continue that streak here. I think they take care of business, but I'd love to see them be a little bit more convincing in certain key areas like offense, in that passing game in particular.
Well, that's the nightcap for the game as well. So by the time you and I are back home from our trip down to the Forest City to check out Queens at Western, we might be able to catch that one as well. Tom, great job by you. I think it's going to be another stellar week of action. Again, me and Tom are going to be live and direct from Western to check out the Queens Golden Gales against those Western Purple Ponies coming off of their bye, with Queens by the record sitting ahead of them. So you know Western's fired up. Can't wait to be in the house alongside with you on that one, Tom. Last words on the week as a whole.
I mean, as much as it is to my chagrin, we are quickly coming to the end of the regular season here, and you have to start looking at playoff implications for all of these games. And while we certainly have been looking at certain key games earlier in the season as that, having a game like Western Queens, even if Western wins this one, then they still control their own destiny. They will have home field advantage if they obviously win out here throughout the entirety of the playoffs until they get to the Laurier Golden Hawks if they also do the same thing. But there's a lot of other areas that are in play here, with Laurier going for that same idea, with Guelph trying to get as many home games as possible, and obviously Ottawa and Waterloo going after this, Windsor trying to make sure that everything runs through the end of the 401. Carleton right now, I don't know that there's another team that's painted into such a corner of these last few games here. This is where you do or die. This is where your potential season may come to an end, depending on how you finish these games. And even if you get to 4-4, or worst case 3-5, whatever the case, you still might need point differentials in order to beat the last team if there's tie breaks and all of that fun stuff that you and I are going to have to deal with sorting out in just a couple of weeks. So playoff implications start now, and really start getting the anxiousness and everything else tied with a lot of these teams as people start doing calculations in their head about how many wins do we need, what's the points that we need, and everything else. At the end of the day, all you care about is wins and losses. Get those dubs. Focus on that. Don't be messing around with any point differentials. Let's see it. Let's see another fantastic week of football.
Well, and to that point, if you and I are right in at least two of our picks, we might have Carleton and Ottawa teeing off in the Panda game, both sitting at 2-4, with winner getting into the playoffs, or more likely than the other getting into the playoffs. So another stellar week we have ahead of ourselves here, with, as you highlighted, major implications across the board. Again, we'll be in London checking out Queens at Western, and no doubt tuning in on one of or both our cell phones for the other 1 o'clock games: Ottawa at Laurier, Waterloo at Guelph, Carleton hosting New York at 4, and as we just mentioned, the nightcap, Windsor hosting U of T at 7 p.m. Can't wait to see you, Tom, in the Forest City, and everyone else hitting up that game. Be sure to come say what's up. Peter Beers, wear that suit of armor, brother. Because we've been on the other side of our picks for the last couple of weeks. All love, of course. Appreciate y'all so much. And if you don't see us over the weekend, we'll see you next week, breaking it all down right here